So good afternoon, good morning for me. Tim, this is our part. This is part two of an interview with Tim Bowness. Very happy that was able to allocate time for his busy schedule, doing a lot of things like usual musicians do. And all right, so the last time I think we ended up talking about the album from 2001 called "Returning Jesus." Feel free to elaborate on that album and so on and so forth. What memory do you have, and so on and so forth?
Well, Returning Jesus was a bit like Flowermouth in the sense that I think we made it as if it was going to be our last album, really. We made it to be everything we wanted it to be. It was a real sort of labour of love and an idealistic album. And once more, we kind of got everybody we wanted on the album to be on the album, and hopefully made it as good as we possibly could. We went into a studio in Wales, quite a well-known studio, hired out things like Hammond B3 organs, got Steve Jansen back on drums. And I think that was kind of made at the point when Porcupine Tree's star was definitely rising. And for No Man, it didn't necessarily feel like the most essential period, but we absolutely loved the music. And so we dedicated ourselves to making something as beautiful as we could, which is exactly where we were with Flowermouth, except in that case, we were signed to One Little Indian, and it felt like that was going to be our last album for the label. So the idea was, let's just go out with everything blazing, really.
Yeah. Is it fair to say that, the No Man's folk that liked that No Man albums and the period, were going, when Steven Wilson was working with Porcupine Tree, carry the same fan base, if you will, about, although they're two different type of music, right? So
yeah, I mean, I think eventually there was kind of a bleeding into it, because I think I've always, been pragmatic about these things. I think that people who discover Steven's music and Porcupine Tree's music, and because there's a very strong connection between No Man, obviously. Chris Maitland was originally in No Man. Richard Barbieri had originally played with me and No Man. So there's always a very strong connection. And I always felt that people would reach us somehow. But as you say, the music's very different. I think 2001, it very much felt as if Porcupine Tree was the ascendant and No Man was not. But it was very like Flowermouth in the sense that with Flowermouth, we made an album that was as uncompromising and, as I say, very much what we wanted to do, and it ended up selling the best of all of our One Little Indian albums. And the same with Returning Jesus, really, that it wasn't produced at the best time for the band, or even the best time for this particular type of music, but primarily, I hope, because of the idealism inherent in the music, it reached more people, and suddenly we found that there was a real energy and a buzz around No Man again once we'd produced Returning Jesus. So the album, to a certain extent, was written and recorded during something of an emotional slump, but when it was released, there was a very positive atmosphere surrounding it, and that directly led to Together We're Stranger, which I suppose in some ways took Returning Jesus, the title track, which is one of the more abstract pieces on the album, even further. We made this into an album-length investigation of a particular type of mood.
That's beautiful, and it's good to, I suppose, as a musician, or well, as a painter, any people that don't do that kind of work for a living, to have the freedom, the two of you with Steven, have an idea. And not having pressure from, I don't know, for the record label, we want this type of music, or hits, or why they're too long, and so on and so forth. So the two of you in a room for a week, creating great music, and then after that, showing, I suppose, the end product to a record label. I'm hoping that they will like the stuff, But
Together With Stranger, I think, was probably one of the most abstract and difficult albums in a way, but it's become one of the most popular No Man albums. And I suppose, there were quite strong emotions surrounding that album. And I'd been in a long-term relationship that collapsed around that time. also, my father, who is still unbelievably alive, was extremely ill during that time with cancer. So, there were all sorts of emotional pressures informing that music, but I think it made that music stronger.
Absolutely, yeah. The love of your parents. Like I told you at the beginning of the first interview, if it wasn't for my dad showing me music when I was a baby, I wouldn't be in this world probably doing what I'm doing, or I'm doing a lot of things. Because so my son now, he just turned 18, is going to be the same. I mean, we go to concert, I show him stuff. He likes certain amount of music, he doesn't like certain amount of music, but I want him to, hopefully, music be part of his life like it was for me. Whether the type of music I like, that's completely relevant. It's no, I don't want him to be me, right? I'm not the music. I don't like the music my dad like, but the opening up to see the beautiful music or painting or art or opera or it's unbelievable. And for me, seeing a band live, it's like a ritual. I don't know how to explain it, but I'm looking forward to events like that in my life. So I saw a great band on Saturday. I'm going to see, a tribute band, Big Floyd, Brit Floyd tomorrow, and it gave me a lot of satisfaction. I never saw, Pink Floyd as a group, and but seeing equivalent of their music is good enough. So I know.
Well, I'll say for me, it was the opposite, because I had no parental encouragement, and that actually made me more interested, I think, in expression through music and literature and so on, because of the lack of encouragement. So I guess inspiration comes in different ways, really. But and as a correction to the last interview we did, actually, I was 12 when I kind of discovered a lot of the sort of music we were discussing about, the sort of the Pink Floyd's, Led Zeppelin, Tangerine Dreams. It was actually during the very, very hot summer of 1976 that we had in Britain, where it was so scary being outdoors. We were all indoors, and with a lot of my school friends, we were having Sabutio competitions and listening to various albums that belonged to parents and so on. So that was a great way of being introduced to music, which certainly at the time seemed quite exotic, and introduced me to very different types of sonic worlds.
Mm-hmm. It's a beautiful thing, It's like you go into a new town or new country and you get lost in, certain street. You don't know where you're going. You need to go back to dinner or go back to the hotel in 3 hours, but you explore. You might be in Paris or Vienna or Berlin, wherever. You don't know the language, and you walk around and take pictures, take a coffee or tea or whatever, and discovering things. It's the mystery of not have preset or everything. It's beautiful, be not being controlled, if you will, getting lost or discovering new music, or it's a beautiful thing, I think, for human beings. And then later on, you ended up releasing on May 2008, Schoolyard Gods as well. That with, I think, guest musicians were Pat Mastelotto, Travis, Gavin as well. Yeah. Then again, that was that album received great reviews as well.
Yeah, that was a very different album, really, to make, because Returning Jesus was pretty typical No Man, in the sense of Stephen sending me music to work on, me sending Stephen music to work on, and then the two of us kind of combining at the end. And Together with Stranger started in an unusual way, because there was a piece that Stephen had written. He sent it to me, and I wrote something over it, and I got a band in the studio and developed it into a full piece. And once I'd done it, he then told me that he'd already developed this as a bass communion ambient track. But he eventually liked what I'd done with the piece so much that we then had the starting point for the main Together with Stranger suite. But Schoolyard Ghost was quite different, in the sense that I'd written a lot of the music, or I'd co-written the music with certain people like Giancarlo Era. And as I think I mentioned this to you last time, actually, that we then got together and produced the album. And at the very, very end of the Schoolyard Ghost session, we wrote Wherever There's Light. And that was a traditional me, Stephen, in a room together writing from nothing. And it was kind of a magical moment. So Schoolyard Ghost was generally quite different because that was probably the only No Man album where it really was kickstarted by songs that I'd written and brought in.
Amazing, man. And amazing that the the energy, a collaboration, the friendship that you have with Stephen Wills for many years, that the two of you, sometimes with no material, okay, I have Friday and Saturday, or let's meet me somewhere in a studio and see what happened, so
well, it's always been like, it's always been like that.
Wow.
I think that, when we did Schoolyard Ghost, for example, that I brought the pieces in, and I think that Stephen's never satisfied with that, of course, because we get together and suddenly the ideas are flowing. So once I brought something in, he can hear something different. And as I always say, one of the greatest examples of that was True North, which is one of my favorite No Man tracks, and that started off from a miniature piece that I'd written called Another Winter, and I played it to Stephen, and almost immediately he could see where that could go. Then once I'd heard what he did, I could see where that could go. And it was, in the end, quite a mutual creative process.
Got it, perfect. And then, 11 years later, right, from 2008 to 19, you guys released the Love You to Bits. First question, why so many years in between albums?
Difficult. I think mainly that was the time, because when we did Schoolyard Ghosts, we recorded an orchestra at the very end of the sessions. It was on True North, and it was orchestrated by Dave Stewart, who you may know. And at the same time, Dave was also doing an orchestration for a track from what was going to be Stephen's debut solo album. So I think that kind of marked a transition, really, that particular session. So probably for the next 9 years especially, I think Stephen was concentrating on his solo work, even though there was the incident by Porcupine Tree, but I think his solo work had become a major thing for him. But, we did actually get together in that time. A few things, really. We did a gig in 2011, which was really energizing. It was one that ended up as Love and Endings. And we loved that gig because it sounded nothing like any of our albums. It was very true to the nature of the material. But because of the band that we'd selected, it also had a very different identity, and it was taking No Man somewhere different. And we enjoyed that so much that we did a tour in 2012 with No Man. We did quite a few European dates and played in Poland, Germany, Netherlands, etc. And we were intending after that tour, because we'd enjoyed it a great deal, we were intending to do a studio album with the live band. So this would have a very different feel from anything No Man had done before. And as with Schoolyard Ghosts, I kind of been writing quite a number of pieces and preparing for the album. And when I presented it to Stephen, he said he didn't really have enough time because he was working on The Raven That Refused to Sing at that time. And he said, well, look, I'll mix it for you, but this should be your solo album. So that's what became Abandoned Dancehall Dreams. So in a way, Abandoned Dancehall Dreams could have been a No Man album. It was almost a logical follow-on from Schoolyard Ghosts, but that became, in effect, what I call my first solo album, Abandoned Dancehall Dreams. But we'd always kept in touch because obviously Stephen was mixing my albums, and we'd occasionally meet socially and so on. And Love You to Bits was something we'd been working on and off on really for about, good God, 25 years. We had the original idea for that in 1994. And through the years, we occasionally added to it, took away, added, wrote something new. And it was just that in 2019, we both had the time where we could concentrate and finally make Love You to Bits into the album that we'd always wanted it to be. And it was really, that was great fun. It was almost written, I think I said, that was an album that reminded me of the very early days of No Man, when it was just me and Stephen in the studio, when we're working from patterns. in the here and now. And yeah, it was a lovely album to make, actually.
That sounds like a good idea for an album, Here and Now.
Yes.
There you have a title. It's a so in terms of your creative process, how your mind and works. You're always listening or writing stuff down. Whether you go to a supermarket or this morning, or when you go out to dinner with friends, family, whatever. Your ideas come to you, or you sit in front of a piano or guitar and then you make it happen, or the stuff comes to you, or it's a combination of both.
It's always a combination of both, really. But of course, I'm constantly taking notes for lyrics.
Yeah.
Any conversation can be fodder for it. Any relationship can be fodder for it. So, some ways, it's kind of dangerous to talk to me, as I might use your sentence in a lyric. But yeah. So it's certainly in terms of sort of lyrical ideas, I'm always just open to phrases, or indeed sometimes things just pour out. There's an empty page, you have an idea, and it pours out. Musically, again, it can vary, because, as I say, I've just finished what's going to be my 8th solo album, and it's very, very different from any of my other solo albums in that it's all me. I'm playing all of the instruments, I produced it all, and the way in which I worked with that was just, how did I feel that day? It was just it was always opening up the computer and just finding inspiration from a sound or from a particular set of guitar chords. And something happened. I mean, it was funny because I'd not written before that for about 13 months. After I finished Butterfly Mind, I don't like to write for the sake of it. For me, it's got to feel important. It's got to feel inspired in some way. And I'd not felt particularly inspired for 13 months. And then something happened. I just wrote a piece out of nowhere, and that excited me so much that within the week I'd written 5 pieces out of nowhere. And so the new album's got about 17 songs on it, and almost all of them were about chasing a feeling. It was almost opening up the computer and either working with guitar, working with keyboard, working with samples, even working with vocal loops. It was how I felt in that moment. And as a result of it, you've got 17 pieces that go from electronic experiments to straightforward singer-songwriter pieces with acoustic guitar to very harsh industrial rock moments. And this was always just kind of as if a chasing a feeling, following an idea, and then that idea inspiring another idea. So in some ways it's a really instinctive process.
I know, that's great. Out of the 17 tracks, let's say you end up selecting 12. I don't know if you want to select the 17, but
all 17 have been selected.
All 17 will go in. Okay. The question was, what you do with the stuff you understand. Is it difficult for kind of personal question for a musician having the pressure of, because nowadays people don't, it's not my case, but they don't buy vinyls anymore. They don't buy CDs or Blu-ray that much like they used to, right? So many bands, many musicians make money by touring. And is it difficult in your case if you're not touring that much? Well, I need to record an album. I have some idea, but if I spend 2 months doing this, then I won't not be able to do gigs or tour. Therefore, no money coming in, right? What's in terms of paying my bills or whatever. So where's the
touring doesn't necessarily touring doesn't necessarily bring in money for a lot of artists, and it certainly doesn't anymore, because if you're a British artist, touring in Europe, touring in America is extraordinarily expensive. Anything from visas onwards to the cost of even taking equipment abroad. And now if you're playing abroad, the merchandise is very, very heavily taxed, or you're not allowed to generate income from the merchandise. It's changed a great deal. So, touring really isn't viable for anybody making money unless you're at a kind of, Madonna or level in effect. Or Robert Plant or something. Obviously certain people can tour and can make big money from it, but it's become incredibly difficult
Really?
for
Wow.
artists that aren't extremely well known. But for me anyway, it's always been I enjoy playing live, and I can get a thrill from playing live, and sometimes you can even it can even be a creative experience. But generally speaking, I've always much preferred making music in the studio. For me, I love writing songs. I love producing music. I love hearing the results of those productions. That's probably always been the biggest thrill for me over live performance. And really, in the era of kind of Spotify and people buying less, it's made me feel, more like Canute going against the tide, that for me, it's become perhaps more important. So if I'm making an album, it was always very important to make the best album I could. And artwork was important. The words were important. Just the overall experience of a physical album as well was important, because it's something that I fell in love with. And if anything, I take even more care over that now. You were talking about track selection. This new album is going to be very different because I am using all the 17 tracks, but the track selection, the sequencing was, probably took longer than writing some of the songs, And when I've actually made some of the albums of late, things like Late Night Laments and so on, Flowers at the Scene, often it can take me a month and a half, 2 months to get the sequence right. And in general, you are right that I might write 10 to 15 tracks and only go with 9. And you're always trying to make the strongest album statement. And so for me, in terms of sort of sonic quality, the packaging, if anything, it's even more important to me than it ever was, because, if I'm going to go down, I want to go down fighting, and I want to go down with my best work, producing something that I'm very proud of, that I want in the world.
What's your take on, say, yourself and Steven Wilson and so forth? They end up doing remixes in 5.1 and Atmos and so on and so forth, and as if it's done for 5% or 3% of the population. I mean, many people nowadays, I suppose, they don't have a good stereo or listen to music in YouTube or MP3 in the car, because nowadays so many cars don't have here, at least in the United States, CD players, and it's so you work very hard to put a great product, and and a lot of people would not be able to appreciate that. I suppose you are a music guy like myself, who like this stuff. It's disconcerting a little bit, right? So it's
well, it is, and I think that Spotify has impacted on music negatively, and it's not only impacted negatively in terms of income for musicians, it's certainly impacted negatively in terms of art, because remember, format can sometimes dictate art. So a lot of what I suspect you like, and a lot of what people who like my music like, is the album as a format. And when that emerged in the 50s, that particular vinyl LP, it gave a certain amount of time to play with that, of course, previous 10-inch singles and shellac hadn't allowed. And so people then played to that. So the album, to a certain extent, was as much an accident of format. People like Billie Holiday and Frank Sinatra making concept albums in the 50s relating to moods and so on. And then, of course, with the Beatles in 67, although there were examples beforehand with Frank Zappa and so on, and Velvet Underground, but truly transforming the album into a real art form in terms of package, with Sgt. Pepper's. And I think that for me, it's a great sweet spot, the album, the vinyl album. I mean, CD, I think, was fantastic from a sonic point of view, but because it could accommodate 80 minutes, I think it was actually quite dangerous for the album. I think that many people would just fill 80 minutes for the sake of filling 80 minutes. There was an awful lot of filler in the CD age of albums, in my view. There were also some great albums, of course, but, an awful lot of albums I think of from the late 80s to the early 2000s were overlong, were undisciplined, and people just using the format. So people do often make music to formats. And the interesting thing with Spotify, as you say, is that people listen to it on equipment that isn't hi-fi, which isn't necessarily a big problem, because music, if it's emotional, can touch you on whatever equipment you're listening to. You know, if I think of the first ever albums or singles I bought, it was a terrible record player, but I still loved the music and connected to the music.
Sure.
And but the problem, I think, with Spotify is that, you know, music pouring through like water, it just seems to have very little value. And one of the things, well, two of the things they found since Spotify is that people don't engage with music in the same way they did. It's pure background in a lot of cases. Also, they've noticed the introductions. So, for example, if you take Wish You Were Here by Pink Floyd, that entire album begins with an extraordinarily long, slow build-up. It's an all-enveloping experience that you've got to buy into and you've got to give yourself to. And they found in the era of Spotify, people are like sort of 1980s A&R men, that they'll listen to the first few seconds, and if it doesn't hit them, they'll ignore it. And so what they found is that a lot of artists now, when they're producing their Spotify singles, introductions are virtually non-existent. You're in with the chorus or in with the hook straight off. And so it really has kind of impacted on the nature of composition and production. And because, of course, people are listening to it increasingly on quite poor equipment, a lot of productions even are using very lo-fi values. And I don't mind this because, you know, with my kind of productions, I've always loved something that Mitchell Froome used to do, which is combine, I suppose Nine Inch Nails did as well, where you'd combine immaculate recordings with really poor recordings, and you get this fusion that's quite interesting sometimes. But yeah, so, you know, Spotify, I think, has kind of affected people's attention spans. I think it's affected the quality of recording of music, and I think it's also affected, you know, the nature of composition sometimes. And obviously, you know, beyond that, there's the moral, ethical aspect of how little it actually pays musicians. You know, music has been devalued by Spotify. There's no doubt.
What could be, you know, you guys get paid 6 cents of, you know, 0.006 cents, 6 cents out of every time that a particular track is free. So what do you think could be the solution there, right? If all the musicians say they put pressure on the record label, okay, take me out of Spotify, that will go out of business. So what is it?
It's difficult
giving
to say.
A bigger share, or?
Yeah, it's difficult to say because Spotify clearly is just a digital company. It's a service. You know, they don't care about music. They never cared about music. And I think a very good example of that is that, you know, they can acquire the back catalogue of incredibly famous bands for free from the record companies, whereas they will pay, as they did with Joe Rogan, a phenomenal amount of money for a podcaster. Now, I've never understood why Amazon streaming, Spotify streaming, why, if they care about music, they don't pay advances for musicians to develop their work through their services. But I don't think they see it like that. And clearly, you know, when they pay for podcasters, that shows what disregard they have for music. Music comes free. Now, the record companies, of course, you've got to realize this for them. For a major record company, you might own a third of the world's recording output, of which much of it's out of copyright. You know, if you're looking at the 40s, 50s, 60s music, a lot of it now is out of copyright. Royalties aren't being paid to the artists, and this is just going purely to record companies. Because in a lot of cases, the artists are dead or the estates don't exist, and so on. And it's kind of interesting, really. So record companies can do well out of Spotify, partly because they own so much music. So 0.0003 of a cent or what have you, when it's over millions of releases, that says a lot. But, you know, I think a good statistic as well for sort of new artists is that I think 80% of artists on Spotify have fewer than 50 listeners. I think I read that somewhere. it's impossible, I think, to gain traction. I mean, other things I hate about Spotify, the absence of credits. If you're, for example, an engineer or a producer or a session musician, you don't exist on Spotify. The world of Spotify doesn't acknowledge you. If I think of even my releases on Spotify, most of them have got the wrong years assigned to them. It has a disregard for music history, music production. I'm not a fan, I think you can realize from this.
Yeah. On the other hand, platform like, Bandcamp, it's kind of, only take 10%, right? The artists get 90%. It's not as famous, as popular as Spotify, where you can search among many, many artists or bring you machine learning recommendation. If you like that, you could like that. But I think then again, it's a business. I don't know if they do like or they care about music, but at least they are very fair, paying 90 cents of a dollar to the artist.
I think Bandcamp's entirely different. Bandcamp's like Burning Shed in that respect, that I think that
that's right.
It is primarily there for musicians. And obviously, when I set up Burning Shed in 2001, it was because I've been signed to major labels, independent labels. I've published things myself. And so I knew a lot of aspects of the business. And really, we just produce something transparent where it benefits the artist. And I think Bandcamp does that to a great extent as well. And absolutely, I approve of what Bandcamp does and the platform it provides musicians with. Yeah,
that's great. Let's talk a little bit about the Burning Shed. You end up creating that with Peter and Pete, believe it or not, Peter and Pete. How that idea came about? What was the motivation of? I think you elaborate a little bit of putting that, creator. I don't know, a platform for distributing music from many artists, like many record label like ECM, DGM, Mute, 4AD, great record label. So, what was the motivation to do that?
I think the motivation was this: that Stephen and I had set up No Man Mail Order. No Man Mail Order, we'd had about 4,000 people subscribe to us. And Stephen and I used to send out newsletters, and we produced always CDRs or cassettes outside of our official releases and say, if you want something extra, write to No Man at this address. And we had about 4,000 people on our list. And we used to get to those people with newsletters that we sent out, physical newsletters that Stephen and I would send out maybe once every 6 months. And if we were releasing a CDR of, say, our radio sessions from my home address, we'd sell about 2,000. It was an interesting thing. We'd send out 4,000 newsletters and we'd sell about 2,000 of this. So that was something in the back of my mind, to do that properly, because it was all up until the late 1990s, sending out something in the snail mail, people ordering from my house and me posting something. That was the No Man Mail Order. So there was a motivation to do that better. And also, I kind of had an idea about setting up a label that would allow people to release their more experimental work cost effectively. So at that time, late 1990s, early 2000s, it was still a boom time for CD sales, but a lot of artists I knew might have a fantastic idea for an album, but because it was only going to sell 5,000, the record company were not interested. So I'd kind of floated the idea around for a few years. And suddenly this online on-demand opportunity came up, and somebody I knew, Pete Morgan, who'd supported No Man in the past, actually owned one of these machines and had his own warehouse. So Pete, I was in contact with a fair amount socially, and I put this idea to him. And because he was a No Man fan, he went along with the idea. Peter Chilvers had been somebody I'd been discussing the label idea with, and he completely agreed and was interested and wanted to contribute to it. And Peter's skill was that in that period, he was one of the very few people who knew about e-commerce. It sounds now primitive, but in the year 1999 or 2000, not very many people knew about e-commerce, could set a site up that took money and processed money. Yeah. And so that was what Peter did. Peter was working for a company called Play.com, who were Amazon's biggest competitor at that time. So really, it was a fantastic combination of the three of us, really, that Pete had the machinery, and he'd also run a record label in the past, an indie label called Noisebox, which was really interesting. We all cared about packaging. We all cared about artistic focus. And as you said, we loved the idea of labels like 4AD, Factory, ECM, even the original Charisma, labels that had a real artistic focus where you could trust what you bought from them. And so we started off with a few kind of experimental side projects. So I gave a singer-songwriter project. Stephen Wilson gave his first Bass Communion album. Rogerino gave us an album. And luckily, it picked off right from the start. We started off by sending out letters to the people on the No Man mail order list. That's how that ties in.
Yeah. Wow.
And luckily, people came to us. And so it worked from the off. And this is a good thing in the industry in the sense that 22 years later, we're bigger than we ever were. We've got over 122,000 people on our mailing list. And these are people globally who prefer buying and interacting with physical music like we do. Because, the whole point is, for me, it's like when you're making an album, when you're putting a package together, you've got to put something together that you love, that you would fall in love with, that you would want to buy. Because we're in a world where there's so much out there and there's so many problems that it has to feel worthwhile. And I guess that was one of the motivating factors for Burning Shed. And luckily, 22 years later, it's still thriving despite doing everything you shouldn't, really.
Despite everything you shouldn't. Well, I'm glad you should. I'm glad you did. It's a great website, and I buy a lot of stuff from you guys, and great selection from different record labels. You can sort, filter. You go to the sale where it's on sale, and sometimes you have like a signed CDs or signed albums, so people are willing to pay the premium. The shipment arrived here within a couple of weeks, well packaged. I never have anything from Berger destroy or a CD band or an album by there. It's great. I mean, it took care of the whole process, from selection, packaging,
It was a great team we have. Now we've got a fantastic team of sort of pickers and packers and warehouse managers and IT people and customer service. Whereas, when it started, it was just me, Pete, and Peter. And initially, it was just Pete, I'd produce the newsletters, do all of the text. Peter would do the whole site design and e-commerce. And Pete would produce the CDRs, and it was a tiny room in his then warehouse, whereas now it is, the warehouse Burning Shed. And I think that, probably up until about 2008, if we were doing a very big release, it would probably be me and Pete sending things out. But luckily, since then, we've been able to get some great people around us doing, as I've said, permanent P&P, customer services, and obviously IT.
It's great that you care. Many companies out there, in whatever product they have, they don't care.
No, I mean, but we care about every aspect, from site design to site text onwards. It matters.
Of course, it matters, right? That's exactly the point of having a good strategy. I think if you have a good strategy for whatever you do, you will succeed, right? So, if you're like a Mickey Mouse company or whatever, if you don't care, you don't put attention to every single detail. If you have 10 steps from this to this, or from there, if you don't care for any of improving every step along the way, it's nothing good will come out of the end, or the company will run out of business in a couple of years. So,
and I think that also goes for, making albums, that you've got to make it the best you can, because if it fails, at the very least, you're proud of what you did.
That's right.
That's the whole thing. And I think it's the same that, as you say, with Burning Shed, even from the packaging of what's sent out, it's going to be as good as it can. And if that company fails, it's not failed because of it being mediocre.
That's right.
It's the best it could.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, it's absolutely. Do you looking back in the last, I don't know, 30 years or so, you feel that you see an upswing? Your take on how art, rock, and progressive music have changed over the last, I don't know, 30 years?
Well, certainly over the last 30 years, there probably has been more interest. I mean, I think that it's kind of the last 5 years have suffered more as streaming has kind of eaten into more and more potential physical sales. And as you say, anything from taking the CD out of cars onwards has affected these things. So there are more challenges, I'd say, over the last 5 years. And also, you know, things like, as I said, it's got very difficult for bands to tour abroad, but equally, it's got very difficult for a company like Burning Shed to post abroad. You know, 2 or 3 years ago, pre-pandemic, we could have sent something to you and it would have got there within the week, possibly even 2-3 days. But costs have become far higher. Deliveries have become far slower. Countries, to a certain extent, have become more insular. You know, Brexit's a good example with Britain, but it's everywhere. It isn't just Brexit. It isn't just Britain. It's also getting to America, Canada, and so on. There kind of seems to be a slightly more insular nationalist view globally, for better or worse. And that's certainly affected, you know, companies like ourselves. I mean, luckily, we are still thriving despite that. But I think that's because we attract a particular type of obsessive fan. Now, I don't know, has it improved? Yes, it's improved over the last 30 years. There's no doubt more music, more media coverage, and more of a possibility to make a name for yourself. I mean, you know, my chums in Big Big Train are a good example of a band who in 2009 no one would have heard of, but by 2019 were getting in the top 30 in the British charts, which is fantastic as an achievement for people of their age and with their integrity. It was a wonderful achievement. So yes, there are possibilities, and music is still getting out there. I don't know for the future. That is, you know, an entirely different thing, really. I'm not sure.
In Latin America, in Latin America, progressive music is very, very popular. Any you know, any band that tours in Latin America, they do, because not everybody goes there to, I don't know, Chile, Argentina, Brazil, Peru, Bolivia, etc. The bands and the musicians that go there, they do very well, you know, I suppose financially, and they it's very popular in Latin America, progressive music, art rock, and many bands. So it's great. So, and let's talk a little bit about some of your work as well, solo artist. The album that you did in 1994 with Richard Barbieri called Flame, man, that's a great album. I really like this stuff because I like Richard, and you know, from the Porcupine Tree, Japan, Rain Tree Grow, and so on and so forth. It's good.
Well, Flame was kind of produced concurrently with Flowermouth. So when I was making Flowermouth, I was also making Flame with Richard. And the No Man album was much more cinematic, if you like. You know, it was a real widescreen album. What I was doing with Richard was much more intimate, and we wrote and recorded a lot of that in his flat in Catford, and we did a couple of days in the studio where we got people like Gavin Harrison, who drums on the album, and Danny Thompson to play. So that was quite an effortless album to make, really. And obviously I've always kept in touch with Richard, and we wrote a couple of pieces about a year ago, and we're doing that. We're working on a couple of songs at the moment that might find release in the next few months. Who knows?
Wow, great, man. Excellent. In 2000, you released The World of Bright Futures, another great album with Samuel Smile. That's according to me, a great album as well. So,
well, that was an interesting one, because I've been playing with Peter and Michael. It was Michael Bearpark and guitar. Michael, I've known since he was about 15, and he was like a guitar prodigy in the neighborhood. And he's a fantastic player, very inventive. He's a professor of theoretical chemistry, and he applies his science to his guitar playing. And Michael and I used to just do intimate gigs. So when I was doing quite big rock gigs or electronic gigs with No Man, on the side, I'd be doing tiny gigs in bars or various other places with Peter and Michael, which were very intimate. We used to play in University of London, but also Cambridge University. We used to play a few intimate rooms there. And it was kind of an antidote because No Man was getting quite big and I loved it. You know, it's the whole thing. I love the noise of being in a big band, but equally, I love quite intimate singer-songwriter performances. So what I was doing with Peter and Michael was singer-songwriter performances, and we just played gigs through the years while I was doing No Man. We also did occasional supports for people like Porcupine Tree, and we even did a major BBC radio session on Radio 2. But World of Bright Futures was the first album we made, and that was kind of we'd already been sort of a band for 7 years, and we'd had other players working with us as well. We had, you know, a cellist working with us and a saxophonist and so on. We had different lineups.
That's great. Your debut solo album, My Hotel Years, was released on One Little India in 2004. Feel free to elaborate how difficult was every time you do something, you know, the first time.
That wasn't difficult.
Have a lot of challenges.
Those albums, it's not my favorite, as I've always said. I think with My Hotel Year, I'd had a run of what I think was really strong albums in the sense of Returning Jesus, Together with Stranger, and the album I did with Peter, California Norfolk. I mean, that was a lovely album to make as well. So those 3 albums, I think, were almost a trilogy where it was a wonderful experience making the music, and I think it came through in the music. There was kind of a free-flowing ambition. And I'd also been working with a German band, with a guy, Markus Reuter, and also Bernhard Heinrich, and we were Centrozoom at that point, and I'd worked with them for about 3 years. And in 2004, I released 2 albums, and one of them was the Centrozoom album. The Centrozoom album came about because Marcus wrote to me when he heard Returning Jesus and said, absolutely adore this album. I'd love to do some work with you. He came over to England and we had a chat, we got on, and then I flew over to Germany. And it was one of those experiences where from nothing, we wrote about 70, 80 minutes of music. I had no idea of what they wanted. And we just improvised. And from that improvisation, we kept some of it and we wrote some pieces over passages and so on. So we wrote more solid pieces. And that was an interesting project for 3 years where we did a lot of spontaneous gigs all over Europe. Festivals and then some unusual venues just for the sake of it. And I think that was quite a strong experimental album. But My Hotel Year came about because I was working with 4 or 5 different people, from Roger Eno to Stephen Bennett to Peter Chilvers again. And Hugh Hopper as well, who once had been in Soft Machine. And 1 or 2 pieces were emerging. There was no album, there was no project that was coming out of these one-offs. And so My Hotel Year was a way of soaking up the best of these pieces that had got away, of these mini collaborations with Hugh Hopper or with Marcus or with Peter or with Roger Eno. So I just kind of put them together in one album along with one singer-songwriter piece that I'd written called Black Rock 2000. And that was the album. And it was kind of, it has a coherent sound because it was David Picking did a lot of the engineering and co-production. And he was very good. He had a great sonic sensibility. And I wanted to work with him because I did a guest vocal with him in 2001. And he also appeared on Together with Stranger by No Man. So I think that he's the best thing about that album in the sense that it's got a good sound. But I just think, for me, it's weird. There's kind of, it seems to be shades of grey, that album for me. And also it feels, perhaps it's because I know how it was put together, it feels cobbled together from various bits and pieces and not necessarily working as a coherent whole. Whereas things like Centrazune, California, Norfolk, together with Stranger, Returning Jesus, they were very focused. Whether they were spontaneous or whether they were fully developed, they were really focused. And I think that My Hotel Year didn't have that level of focus.
Yeah. When you release a new album, let's say the latest album that you're finishing, that you with 17 tracks, and it gets out there to the public, and you work very hard, you're very happy with everything. Does it bother you? Do you read critics or
Yeah, I think you
bothers
do.
you that people do like the stuff, don't like the stuff, or you prefer to avoid the stuff because it may affect you psychologically? I don't know how to say
It
that.
never affects me psychologically at all, really. Of course, it's fantastic when people understand the music as it was intended to be understood. That is great. And obviously, very positive reviews can be nice to receive. No, it doesn't. I think the thing is, affects me more is if, for example, if I've made something that I fully believe in and fully think, you know what, I'm incredibly happy with that, it doesn't bother me what the response is. If I've made something where I'm not so sure, maybe this isn't as good as it could be, or maybe I should have worked on this more, then you're bothered. Because I think that's the whole thing, that really, if you're fully satisfied with what you put out there, very little can hurt you. If you're unsure, everything can hurt you, because you have, so it's got to be right from the point of release, really. I think you've got to really solidly believe in it. I mean, sometimes reactions are disappointing. So, for example, with my solo albums, generally speaking, I've received very, very positive reviews on my solo work. And the solo albums, I think, have been, for a lot of people, surprisingly eclectic. And the new album is even more eclectic. It really does experiment in terms of sort of sonics and pace. It's a very different album in some ways for me, in the same way that Butterfly Mind was. And what's kind of interesting to me is that most of my solo albums have been this. They've been quite eclectic. And the one solo album that wasn't was Late Night Laments. And Late Night Laments was me, to a certain extent, finding myself in that melancholy, atmospheric singer-songwriter sweet spot. And I hope making my best album in that particular territory. And what was interesting with that album is that it followed two albums that were nothing like I normally do, Flowers at the Scene and Lost in the Ghostlight, which was a conceptual work. Yeah. And what's quite funny is that Late Night Laments, which I absolutely, adored making, comes out. And although it generally received positive reviews, it was interesting to see, it's the same old stuff, just made the same album again. And it's because, of course, it was a consistently quiet, pretty melancholic album. And you're thinking, well, wait a minute, didn't say that on Flowers at the Scene, didn't say that on Lost in the Ghostlight. So it was quite interesting that I think Lost in the Late Night Laments perhaps was in my sweet spot, and it's what everybody thinks I do. And it was therefore interesting to see people saying, oh God, that's what he always does. And when Butterfly Mind came out, it was suddenly, my God, this is surprisingly eclectic and experimental. When I'm kind of thinking, well, what was Wild Opera? What was Centrazune? What was Flowers at the Scene? So it's very odd. I mean, that's an interesting thing that sometimes, whenever I put an album out and whenever I write a song, it always feels like the first time I've ever done it, which is a good thing, I think. It'll be interesting seeing how people receive the new album, because, of course, it's very different, partly because I'm playing all of the instruments. So, it'll be interesting to see what the reaction is. But generally, no, it doesn't affect what I do. I mean, the only thing that really affected what I did was, I've told this story before, but it's true that when I produced my first ever vinyl album with a band called After the Stranger, and that was a real My Hotel Year, in that it was putting together lots of tracks that were coming from different sources to make a vinyl album. And the vinyl album did everything I wanted it to, in that it got a lot of local radio play, and the reviews for it introduced me to Stephen Wilson. But the album itself, I thought, was awful because of me. I think the music was pretty good, but my singing was horribly overstated. The lyrics were horribly overstated. And listening to that on vinyl in the way that I listened to all of my music at that point in the late 80s, I suddenly realized how terrible I was. So that was, that's an occasion where you realize, oh my God, things have to change. And, within weeks of that, my approach to writing lyrics and singing transformed. So that was probably one of the biggest periods of kind of self-education, really.
That's great for the comment and open up. I think if people were to have like a physical thing in front of them, right? A CD or a vinyl Blu-ray, where they open it up, they look at the pictures, and they read the comments or the font that we use, or the cover, the quality of the paper, and then listen to the album, right? Put the vinyl, put the CD, they will have much, much better appreciation, right? Taking everything into consideration than going to Spotify, listen to, never have the album, never seen the album, never seen the cover. Oh, the Spotify recommend me the latest Tim's album, and you listen to 20-second track. I don't like it. The next track, 20-second. It's okay. The next, so then they listen to an album, quote unquote, a new album in like 3 minutes without listening to anything, without putting attention. I don't like to live life like that. I mean, things got
I think the thing is that when you buy an album, especially physical, you tend to invest more in it. If it doesn't get you the first time, it might get you the fifth time. And so, yes, I think you tend to listen to it more, absorb it more, and so on. And I think you're right that artwork, to a certain extent, I mean, a great example, going back to something like Wish You Were Here, that was something I was absolutely entranced by as a 12-year-old. And it was the music and the artwork, and they complemented each other, and it invited you into an entirely different world. It was although it was quite bleak and emotional music, it was also an escape from ordinary life. And so I think that, yes, that artwork and interacting with that can sometimes enhance the meanings of the music. So, it can all come as a sort of package of lyrics, artwork, the musical sensation that can give you a deeper connection to the artist. One of my favorite albums of all time, Hijira by Joni Mitchell. Often I've been buried in that gatefold, absorbing the lyrics, absorbing the look of the artwork, and it's created its own world that isn't only just sonic.
Amazing. In let's see, in May 2020, you guys, the two of you with Steven Wilson, launched the album Years, and an audio only podcast. Feel free to elaborate. What was the motivation to doing that together? I don't know if you guys, with lack of time, I suppose, it's hard to keep on doing that. But what was the main motivation of doing that and putting that podcast together?
Well, that one was Stephen phoned me up. I think it was on the first day of lockdown, and he postponed the release of The Future Bites.
Yep.
And said, look, I was thinking we should do a podcast. What do you think? Any ideas? And so we were on the phone for about an hour and a half, discussing what we wanted to do. And I think both of us decided that we wanted to give back to music what music had given to us, because, as you were saying about yourself, music has been very important to both of us. It's been an absolute passion and something we've lost ourselves in countless times over the years. And whenever we meet, we will still discuss music, and we'll still discuss film, we'll discuss books, we'll discuss our personal lives as well. But music still holds a vital place for both of us. So we wanted to give back to music what music had given to us. And we discussed a format for it. And then we were discussing names, and there were all sorts of ridiculous names that we came up with that I shan't pass by you, but some of them hilarious. And then I came up with the album years, and that was it. We had the format, the name, and so on. And Stephen got Heiko Mueller to do the caricature, which I think defined the visual image of it. He had an idea about the visuals. So it was a really nice collaborative thing. And we did it initially more regularly because, of course, we were free because it was the pandemic. There was the lockdown.
Right, you could, yeah.
So we didn't really have that many places to go. You know, that was our idea of a night out, was the album years. And yeah, it's basically a continuation of the conversations that I've been having with Stephen since 1987. So it's been really enjoyable to do, and there will be a lot more to come. I think we just find it difficult finding the time to do it regularly, really, because obviously over the last year, Stephen's been working with Porcupine Tree live and releasing their last album. He's also been working on a brand new solo album. I've been working on a solo album. He's been doing a lot of mixing projects. I've got Burning Shed, and we've both got families as well. And of course, you know, that takes up time. So, you know, but yeah, that's why haven't been as many album years as perhaps there should be, but we're definitely thinking of doing more.
Well, hey, that would be great. I will listen to all of them. Feel free to elaborate your collaboration with Giancarlo Era. Have you ended up meeting him, and what's attracted to you to work together with Giancarlo?
I've ever met Giancarlo, yeah, many times. Yeah. And we've done some gigs together in Italy and Britain as well. Basically, Giancarlo approached me because he was a big No Man fan, and he sent me a CD of his band No Sound. It was one of the very first CDs he'd put out. And although I could hear the influence of particularly Pink Floyd, No Man, Porcupine Tree in his music, I thought there was a particularly unique, sweet melancholy in what he was doing. And so we met up, partly because he wanted me to sing on a No Sound track. So I guested on a No Sound album. And the album did well, and the writing of the track was really enjoyable. And so that the album developed from that, really. We wrote the Memories of Machines album over a period of 5 years, and we met up in all sorts of places. We wrote it in Britain, we wrote it in Manhattan in America, we wrote it in Italy and Rome. We went to all sorts of studios. And what was interesting about that album is that my new album, which I've written over a 3-month period, is stylistically all over the place. The album I was making with Giancarlo was written over a 5-year period in about 4 different countries, and yet was stylistically all of a piece. And I think that when I write with Giancarlo and when I write with Peter Chilvers, it's very natural, it's very good, and we're always in the same space. So I think the music I make with them is more stylistically and emotionally limited, but it's very nice to make. It's a very creative process, and I think we do something worthwhile. When I do something with Stephen Wilson, I've said before, a bit like with my solo work, it could go anywhere because both of us have got tremendously eclectic tastes and passions. And I like doing both. You know, I love Late Night Laments as much as I love Butterfly Mind, even though one of them is stylistically all over the place. One of them is very focused. So I think that when I write with, as I said, people certainly like Peter Chilvers and Giancarlo, it's almost finding an emotional sweet spot that we can all inhabit and enjoy working in. So it's great fun working with them. And I've written a couple of things with Giancarlo over the last few years. So we're still in contact. And I think that, you know, there's no doubt that we'll do something together again.
Yeah, that's great. An album which is important to me and important for a lot of people, I think important to you, the Rain Tree Grow. Feel free, what memories, feeling do you have? Have you ever worked with David Sylvian to begin with? No.
No, I've been in contact with him
Yeah.
via email.
Yeah.
I've never worked with him. I've worked obviously with the others, Jansen, Barbieri.
Yeah.
And well, Japan were a band that I loved when I was at school. So, you know, when I was at school in 1980, I bought Gentleman Take Polaroids. It was a double single and absolutely adored it. And what I loved about Japan, the single can be an art form as well. I love singles. And Gentleman Take Polaroids was a great hook-laden single that fitted in with the times while also being quite ambitious. But what was particularly nice is that the B-sides were very experimental, very unusual, and suggested that there was a depth and a creativity there. And so, you know, Japan was certainly one of my favorite bands growing up. And, you know, an artist we've not discussed, somebody like David Bowie was also a huge influence for me. And so I followed their career, you know, anything from Dali's Car to the David Sylvian solo works to the Dolphin Brothers and so on. I'd always had an interest in what they had to say because they were such unique musicians. And so Rain Tree Crow, along with, you know, Talk Talk's Laughing Stock, was certainly one of my favorite albums of 1991. You know, it's an album I absolutely adored. And I think that they came into the frame, as I think I may have mentioned in the last interview, that we were doing no man gigs as a trio. So it was me, Ben, Stephen Wilson, and backing tapes. And despite having the backing tapes, it wasn't sterile. It was really quite aggressive and passionate. And it was almost like we had three lead performers, because Stephen was a great guitarist, Ben, stunning violinist, and I'm at the front singing. So it was almost like we had three lead people and backing tapes. And this is when we got our first contract, signed to One Little Indian and signed to Hit and Run Music and so on. But once we were signed, they wanted us to have a rhythm section, be more orthodox. And so Stephen and I, partly as a joke, kind of looked at what our favorite albums were that year and said, okay, well, if we can work with the Talk Talk or Rain Tree Crow Japan rhythm section, we'll do it. And unbeknownst to us, the people at the label and the people at our publishing company got in touch with them. So at our next gigs, Jansen, Barbieri, and Khan were there, and also, you know, Lee Harris and the Talk Talk rhythm section were there. And we ended up being managed by Talk Talk's manager for a few years, and Jansen, Barbieri, and Khan obviously ended up working with us. And, you know, to this day, I'm still in contact with Steve and with Richard, and obviously, sadly, you know, Mick died, as you know.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, I do. Yeah. That's a great album. I have no idea why they end up only doing one album and nothing happened.
Yeah, it's very odd. I mean,
very weird. Yeah.
Because we were talking about creativity, and as I said, you know, one of the great things about working with Ryan Hulse, Stephen Wilson, Giancarlo Erra, Peter Chilvers, and, you know, Marcus and Centralune as well, is that music comes easy. When I'm writing with them, the music happens. And I think you forget that doesn't always happen. You know, I've had quite a lot of aborted musical relationships where you've got nothing to say to each other. You know, you can't even write a song together. So chemistry and connection are rare in some cases. But I've been lucky, you know, since I met Stephen in 1987, since I met Brian Hulse in 1987, that I've been working with people where it's not been a chore to write music. It's been a joy to write music, or it's been a really mutually satisfying experience. So the thing is with Rain Tree Crow, from what I understand it was never necessarily a joy for them to write. You know, the music is great, but it was never necessarily flowing very easily. And I know that, you know, other bands have had this as well. You know, Roxy Music, for example, it could often be a very difficult process writing. So, you know, maybe that. And obviously, you know, somebody like Peter Gabriel has found it very difficult to come up with much music over the years, and it's possibly because his life has deviated away from music. But so that's it really. That I think perhaps another album didn't happen because maybe the music didn't happen as naturally as they'd have liked, and B, perhaps the personal communication, the ego. There are sometimes egos in relationships, in musical relationships, and I've been very lucky that again I've not really had that. That Stephen might be exceptionally well known, but he is not in any way egotistical. In my experience, Stephen is a naturally creative, very open person. And I'd say the same about Giancarlo, the same about Peter Chilvers, the same about Brian Hulse.
Yeah, the Stephen that that's my opinion. The Stephen may be different than the Stephen that people see when they go to see Porcupine Tree, I suppose. I don't know where I'm going with that, but some Robert Fripp is the same. It's like some people come across differently on interviews or a stage that in real life. I don't know if I'm explaining myself. I suppose a musician or an artist or a comedian, whatever profession, you kind of show a persona on stage that not necessarily is you or the Stephen. You're in this case the Stephen Wilson that maybe he's very humble and quiet and open and non-talkative or whatever. Yeah.
Of course, well, certainly, yeah. I mean, and I guess that we've worked as friends and collaborators since 1987. But I mean, some musicians I think are conscious of image, are conscious of how they project to the audience, and yes, sometimes a private persona can be very different from what's projected. So it can be the opposite. Some people can present themselves as very with the people, very humorous and humble, but be quite arrogant off stage. And then you have people like Peter Hammill. I mean, Peter Hammill is somebody who, again, I loved when I was at school, whose music was very important to me. And he's become a friend. He's become somebody who I socialize with. And I can say that Peter as a person is as gentle, funny, and helpful as his music is violent and scary. So he's extraordinarily different off stage.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't have that many questions left. Looking back at your life, any people you wish you have had the opportunity to work with? Like you mentioned David Bowie and the folks from Talk Talk, great bands, man. It's any looking back, any artist that you wish you have had the opportunity to work with?
Of course, and I'd still love to work with Kate Bush if that were a possibility, but then who wouldn't? There are all sorts of musicians that I'd have loved to have done something with in certain ways. Brian Eno, Peter Chilvers, who I work with, works regularly with Brian Eno, and Brian I know has been to at least one of my gigs. But obviously, he's somebody I would be fascinated to work with. The late Angelo Badalamenti, the film soundtrack composer who worked with David Lynch, I'd always have loved to have done something with him. And there are other, film composers, people like John Barry, I'd have loved to have done something with because his orchestrations were so rich and so beautiful. And there are probably dozens more who I cannot at the moment think of. But I'd also be interested, to work with certain producers, people like Trevor Horn, for example, partly because his method of working is so different from mine that it would be great fun and great torture to be in the studio with him for a day. And I'd love to do that. But so there are any number of musicians it would be lovely to work with. And sadly, quite a number now are dying. So, there are a number of great jazz musicians who are on the ECM label that it would have been so nice to have worked with. I mean, one of my favorite bass players, two of my favorite bass players who are dead, Jaco Pastorius and Eberhard Weber. Wonderful, wonderful musicians. A guitarist who I think has now made his last album. He's 82, so unlikely he'll do any more. But Ralph Towner was a great jazz musician who also worked with textural music and classical music and almost Brazilian folk as well. You know, he's a great player. So there are all sorts of players that it would have been wonderful to work with, and I'm sure there are plenty living and young who would like to work with as well.
Yeah, I'm kind of selfish person, so you know, I don't want, I don't know, Kate Bush to retire. You know, or David Sylvian. It bothers me that, of course, bother me quote unquote that I'm not them, right? So David Sylvian, Kate Bush, both you mentioned both, and that great musician. Why they don't tour? I mean, from a financial point of view, the two of them, there will be a money-making machine. If David Sylvian ended up touring and that, you know, whatever the price would be in the UK or here in the United States, the ticket will go like that. The same with Kate Bush. So if they were poor, right? They are not. But if they were poor, they say, hey, we need to tour. I need some money. I need buying a new house, a new studio. So people are willing to pay, you know, like Genesis is a good example. They should never retire. Easy for me to say because I'm selfish, but they're great people. Why they don't tour? Why? I don't know.
Well, I think sometimes life gets in the way. As I've said, you know, why somebody like Peter Gabriel hasn't produced a great deal of new music over the last 20
That's right.
Over the last 30 odd years. I think it's partly because his life is very complex and it goes far beyond music with somebody like that. I think with other artists, you know, people like Thomas Dolby, who I adore, and Kaloon of Prefab Sprout, who I adore, I think that they, in some ways, actually, Blue Nile, another band who are a favourite, I think some of their absence of production has been partly because they don't feel they have the audiences that they'd like or the commercial success that they'd like. So sometimes it is perhaps a sense of ego that, you know, they've never had the success that they felt they deserved and are holding back as a result. I don't know. It's very difficult because for me, whether there was an audience there or not, I know that I would still feel an emotional need to create something, because to me, it's almost like breathing. You know, there's a sense that anxieties, emotions, feelings of love even come out better through music. And I feel that I can express myself through music better than I can express myself perhaps through literature. You know, I've attempted short stories, I've attempted poems, but for me, writing a good song is still the best way of expressing myself. And equally, you know, listening to a devastating song by some of the artists you've mentioned as well can be one of the most satisfying things in life still, for me.
You mentioned Blue Niles, and I was thinking about Cranes and Lash. They're great. Why those, you know, again, my same comment, why people don't tour, man. I will, you know, finally, you know, Peter Gabriel is going to tour starting in a month from now. Actually, I'm going to be going, you know, I'm going to Italy to see him for 2 days, and then I will see him a couple of times here in the US when he comes back from Europe. And then again, you know, I see only one side of them, right? I see Peter Gabriel, the sample, the musician, but he had the studio label, you know, and all the stuff they do. So it's hard for me to, I will argue, right, why they cannot put a new album together, or why they cannot tour again. You know, I would love to see them. I never seen Kate Bush. I never seen David Sylvian, for example. So it's.
But sometimes as well, I mean, and we can build on this one if you like. Sometimes as well, people can fall out of love with music, or music becomes a joy. Yeah. I mean, the thing is that, you know, Stephen Wilson and I know a lot of professional musicians, and we know a lot of well-known musicians, and we also know that there are a lot of musicians out there who actually don't listen to music or don't love music, or music just became a job to them. It became a way of generating income. And I think the thing is that the people I tend to work with, and I include Stephen Wilson in that, still absolutely love music. And there are, of course, professional musicians out there where it was the most important thing in their lives when they were 12, 13, 14, 15. And it's still, in some ways, the most important thing in their lives, along with their family, along with their health and so on. So I think sometimes it's that some people can fall out of love with making music. Again, you talked about Sylvian, but I know that I've read interviews with him where he's not been satisfied with what he's been doing. He's fallen out of love sometimes with the conventional song, or he's felt he's said as much as he can with it. Whereas, and that must be frustrating, if you feel you're not fulfilling the ideas in your head, or music isn't living up to what you want to do. Whereas I've always kind of used this quote from Dennis Potter. Dennis Potter was a well-known playwright in Britain, famous for The Singing Detective. I don't know if you know that. And he always said of his work that he was on a field and he was constantly looking for new bits of the field to till, and he'd always find it excitedly. I've not dug this up. So he was always finding new bits of this field to dig up. And I guess it's been like that for me, that, I'm in my limited field, but, oh, wait a minute, there's a tuft of grass I've not seen before. There's still a sense of excitement, but, maybe life can take its toll, or life can change and music becomes secondary. So that might be an answer to a question that you're asking as to why some people aren't writing, aren't touring. Mark Hollis, once he'd produced his last solo album, that was it. For the last, 20 years of his life. He didn't have anything to do with music. None of the people who knew him socially knew he was a musician.
Well, well, hopefully you will never find out of love with music, Tim, because you yourself and Stephen Wilson will have many great years in front of you, and hopefully we'll see you playing live here in the United States as well. So
that would be very nice. Yeah, hopefully so.
Yeah,
To both.
it was very nice talking to you, Tim. Have a great day. Thanks again for your time, and I'm quite sure we'll do another interview down the road as well. It was very nice talking to you again, and
all right.
Looking forward to seeing you live, the flash again. Thank you very much, man.
Thank you. Bye.